It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Jo Gideon, Liberal Democrat MP Wendy Chamberlain, Chris Cook of the Financial Times and the political journalist Michael Crick. Today, average energy bills are set to go up by £700 a year. The Chancellor responds.
The government is going to step in to directly help people manage those extra costs.
The Bank of England has also just announced another rise in interest rates. Will it be enough to deal with the cost of living crisis? Also today, Northern Ireland's First Minister Paul Givan is set to resign. His party says the Brexit deal is to blame.
We have been warning for some time now and signalling for some time, almost a year, that these institutions cannot survive if the protocol is kept in place.
So what does this mean for power sharing and relations with the EU? Also today,
you're in the doldrums, aren't you, again?
Veteran political journalist Michael Crick tells us about his new book on Nigel Farage. So, as you've heard, this morning we have had a flurry of announcements that will affect the cost of living for all of us. The latest, just as we were coming on air, was a decision from the Bank of England on raising interest rates. Let's just show you the BBC News story. Bank of England raises interest rates for second time in 3 months in bid to cool soaring prices. They've gone up from 0.25% to 0.5%. We've also had an announcement from the energy regulator Ofgem, who have raised the annual price cap by more than half, 54%. Directly after that, we had a response from the Chancellor. He's still in the Commons, having made a statement outlining what the government is going to do to help millions facing what for many will be terrifying increases to their energy bills. Chris, can you just unpick some of what has been announced by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, in terms of the help that is going to be offered?
Sure. So I think the first and most significant thing is that they're going to push through a £200 discount for everyone for this year on energy bills. Now, the thing is, there's a trick here, which is that this is actually going to be in the form of a loan, effectively. So we'll all get a £200 reduction this year, but for 5 years afterwards, our bills will be £40 a year higher. So we'll eventually pay that money back. It's a very Treasury-ish sort of scheme to sort of flatter the public finances and deal with this stuff today. But it really is a short-term fix. And if prices stay high, it becomes a real problem if we're really expecting, people to start paying yet higher charges next year. There are two other things. There was a £150 tax rebate that's going to come through in April for 80% of homes. Those are bands A to D in England. There'll also be a £150 million fund for local authorities to help people in need. For people outside England, there will also be £560 million of Barnett consequentials for Wales and Scotland for them to do their own schemes. And there'll be a separate allocation of funds for Northern Ireland, which doesn't have the same energy regulator as Great Britain.
Let's just hear what Rishi Sunak had to say.
To stand here and pretend we don't have to adjust to paying higher prices would be wrong and dishonest. But what we can do is take the sting out of a significant price shock for millions of families by making sure the increase in prices is smaller initially and spread over a longer period. Mr. Speaker, without government intervention, the increase in the price cap would leave the average household having to find an extra £693. The actions I'm announcing today will provide to the vast majority of households just over half of that amount, £350.
The Chancellor there in the Commons. Jo, will it work? Is it enough to keep households afloat?
Certainly it's a help. Keeping households afloat is a real challenge. We all know that this is a global problem, and it's something that everybody is facing. But in certain households, there will be particular hardships, and obviously I represent Stoke-on-Trent Central, where a lot of people are feeling the pinch extremely. So it certainly is an enormous help. I do think that the extra, I believe there's another 500 million of household support fund available via councils for those on the lowest incomes with things like fuel, and that will be a help as well.
Well, those are bands A to D in terms of some sort of rebate on council tax bills. Will all that work, do you think, to take the sting, as Rishi Sunak says, out of these record rises?
I think it will do very little. We've said there that the average household has costs of £700 or likely to see increases of £700. But we know, for example, people with disabilities see much higher energy costs. So that is only the start. If you add in then the national insurance increase that we're going to see in April, then you're looking at £1,200. For me, £200 plus potentially £150 doesn't go very far, and people will be making very difficult decisions right now.
Michael?
Well, I think that Wendy has a point there. I mean, we're not just faced with national insurance rises, but also other forms of inflation, broadband costs and rail fares, and we're heading for 7% inflation and possibly worse. The other problem, as Chris has outlined, is that this is based on the idea that wholesale energy prices, world energy prices will come down. And if that doesn't happen, then people's bills are going to be higher and higher 2 or 3 years from now. And, of course, if Russia invades Ukraine, that will also put pressure on, bound to put pressure on wholesale energy prices.
Right. I mean, the government intervention will help families with half the cost, Jo, of the average energy price rise. Households will still have to find an extra £300 a year to heat and light their homes. How are you expecting them to do that?
Yes, and I mean, it is a challenge. So
it's pretty basic, isn't it, and fundamental?
Yes. One of the key things that we've been pushing for is the opportunities for jobs, because people's incomes can go up very quickly. We've got a huge number of job vacancies across the country, and in fact the job vacancies are fueling inflation because we've got supply chain problems. So that is a real option for people, and the government, I know, is doing a lot of work helping people into jobs. As I said, the additional household support fund will help the most vulnerable, and there are a number of schemes, like the warm homes discount that have been continued.
I mean, there is an extension of that, but it's not a particularly significant increase in that discount, the warm homes discount. Do you accept, Wendy, that this is mainly to do with a global rise in the wholesale cost of gas?
There's absolutely no doubt that there are multiple reasons why we are seeing these increases in prices. But, and as Michael rightly said, there are potentially additional pressures there as well. But these are strategic issues, and potentially if the government had done more in relation to changing where people get their energy from, moved forward with green initiatives, stopped new housing developments, still having gas boilers, these are the things that would actually help as well and might offset some of those strategic issues that Michael talked about.
And Chris, it's not just households, of course, it's businesses as well. Business costs are also set to rise. They will have to absorb these energy costs too, and probably pass it on to consumers.
I mean, that's right. As Michael said before, there's a broad-based rise in prices going on at the moment as well. We're going through a process of inflation. And we at the budget, I was just looking back this morning, at the budget, the OBR was talking about things peaking at 45%. We're now, we're blasting through that. We're looking at potentially significantly higher figures, and that will put pressure on also all parts of the supply chain. I think I take Jo's point about the fact that the people moving into work will obviously find it easier than if they stay out of work, and there are obviously vacancies and there are supply chain problems at the moment. So part of this may be all quite transitory. But if you're a person on a fixed income or in a job as things stand at the moment, these aren't really consolations. And, the fact that what economists talk about a transitory inflation, we mean it's going to shoot up and then drop quite suddenly. It's not really a help, because at the other side of the drop, prices are still much higher. And it's really hard for a household to know what to do. They can't just raise their incomes. If you're a pensioner particularly, you can't, you're really stuck with what you've got. And we all really just have to brace. I'm surprised the government hasn't really bitten the bullet more firmly on this. Maybe surprise is the wrong word. They do this all the time, but they're using a loan to effectively to households to cover a cut in energy costs this year in the hope of getting it back next year. It strikes me as really robbing Peter to pay Paul. And the only politically sort of salvageable way through this is basically to be more generous in the short term. We fundamentally are going to be taking money from future Britons to give to ourselves by borrowing it. I'm sure we can explain it to them.
Are you comfortable with that principle, Jo?
Well, I'm comfortable with a principle which says that we have to be prudent, but we also have to look after the most vulnerable. So I'm comfortable with a targeted support package for the most vulnerable. So we don't want a kind of blanket package which would involve raising money that at some point, I mean, government.
But is it fair to
don't
actually
have
say
the money
that literally people are taking out loans insofar as having to pay their energy bills over a longer period to sort of, yes, suppress the spike? But, I mean, as Chris is saying, we don't know if inflation is going to come down. We don't know if the wholesale price of gas is going to come down. I mean, it's risky, isn't it?
For sure, we don't know anything in terms of future energy policy. And going back to Wendy's point, we have a huge programme to invest in sustainable energy sources, but that's for the long term, and this is a short term problem that I think we do need to find short term solutions for. So I think the Chancellor is probably on a watching brief, and if what measures they put in, that they would have to come back.
Yeah.
Just 2 points.
It reminds me.
Oh, sorry, Chris.
Sorry.
Go on, Chris.
It reminds me a little of the beginning of the pandemic, when the Treasury's first thing was, we'll start giving out loans here and there. And the bets that the Treasury made, I don't know if you remember, at the very beginning of the pandemic, the first thing it did was start setting up loan schemes. And the bet the Treasury seems to be making at the time was, this is probably going to be a very short-term shock, and we can get through it. And it feels a little bit the same. My hunch is that fundamentally the Treasury is going to end up getting out a really big checkbook to try and deal with these cost of living things. I would also, none of us have mentioned the cut to universal credit yet either, which the removal of the pandemic universal credit bonus.
And there was a taper, as the government always says, in response. But do you agree, Jo, I will come to you, Wendy, I'm sorry. But Jo, do you agree with Chris's point there that in the end Rishi Sunak's going to have to get out a big chequebook to cover this?
I mean, he makes a very valid point about the pandemic and the fact that these significant challenges, haven't been predictable in a way that obviously people in Treasury would like them to be. So yes, I mean, we have to come back. We have to look at the facts farther down the line.
Wendy?
Yeah, so I think 2 things I would say. In terms of Chris's point and talking about universal credit and tapering, that helps people on universal credit that are in work. It doesn't help those on universal credit who aren't. So that would be one of the first things that I would say. The second thing is on the day that we're talking about these increases in energy prices, Shell has announced profits of £1.9 billion. So if the Chancellor is looking for somewhere to take money to ensure that we help people, there's a really good place to start.
Well, even today's intervention by Rishi Sunak hasn't convinced some Conservative MPs in the chamber, particularly at the same time that the government is raising other taxes, the NI contributions, national insurance contributions, by 1.25 percentage points. Let's listen to Peter Bone.
Could the Chancellor tell me his approach in increasing national insurance contributions and then handing money back to different people through rebates and discounts, is that a Conservative approach or a socialist approach?
Michael, what's your response to that? This questioning politically of the motivation or the changes to Conservatives of large-scale intervention?
Well, I think a lot of Conservatives are very confused right now about a lot of these things, and it does seem daft in a way to do one and then give the money back. But of course, the national insurance increase was designed as a much more long-term thing to deal with the whole problem of health and social, particularly social care. And I think actually it's right that the government should preserve that. Otherwise, the danger is that social care won't be properly funded in the long term as designed.
Is it a Conservative approach or is it socialist, as Peter Bone says?
Well, I have to agree, Michael. It's it's an essential thing to fund social care.
It may be essential, but is it a socialist way of dealing with something, essentially?
No. Simple answer, no.
We're talking here about the national insurance increase, but the other thing is the freezing of income tax thresholds. So again, if we're talking about, as Jo did, about getting people into work, actually potentially getting people into work or people securing a better job doesn't help them on this front either, because that freezing of the threshold will continue to take away from them. Next week as well in Parliament, we've got the increase in social security, we've got the pension uprating, and the government has already said that they're going to go back to September's figures. We are in completely different circumstances than we are last September. It would be much better if the government looked at the figures now and applied those changes accordingly.
Would you say this is a cost of living crisis that your government is presiding over?
Well, I wouldn't say that the government is presiding over. I would say it's a cost of living crisis, and we happen to be in government. Because if you look, we didn't plan for a global pandemic. We didn't plan for the global situation on energy prices. It's something, though, as a government that we have to tackle, and we have to be reactive to circumstances as they change.
Right. I mean, Chris, in terms of what Jo has just said, you couldn't plan for the pandemic. Some people might question that there could have been better planning for that. But on energy bills rising, is there more that the government could have done? They knew this was coming, and they've known for quite some time.
Yeah, I think there's certainly more they could have done on investment into energy infrastructure. Over the last 10 years or so. But, I mean, we are a country that went through a transformation to move towards more gas previously for sort of quite good reasons, and there will be a lot of unpacking. And this would always, I think it's not plausible to argue this wouldn't have been a hard winter for us, hard year for us, I should say. Regardless, there's no alternative timeline where we're immune from this, from any rise in energy prices. The extent of it, though, the fact that we all have gas boilers in our houses, the fact that we have lots of us have gas cookers in our kitchens, this is all. There have long been energy economists and people who've said it's bonkers that we have this reliance on gas, in part because gas is a really versatile fuel and we use it for the easiest, dumbest stuff. Like, it's portable and, you can put it in cars, do all sorts of stuff with it. Why are we using it to fuel our cookers? So I think there is an alternative timeline where we're better, but not when we're immune. I should say the Bank of England, by the way, have also said they think that we're going to have the biggest fall in real incomes this year since 1990. And it's worth pointing out that sounds bad to begin with, but it's worth remembering that it comes on the back of 10 years of basically stagnant or no wage growth. It is not normal for capitalist Britain for wages to be stagnant for this long, and it's really abnormal for them to drop in this precipitous way.
All right. I mean, but just before we move on, Michael, just to refer back to Prime Minister's questions yesterday, Keir Starmer really focused much of his attack on Boris Johnson around the economy, around cost of living. He said that the Conservative government is low growth and high tax for Conservatives. Can you see why that is going to be the salient issue over the next sort of year or so?
Well, it's bound to be with everything that we've described on the programme, non-stop gloom on almost every front. And, of course, the economy is what drives elections. I mean, to be fair to the Conservatives, a lot of this is not their fault. And if Labour had been in power, they would have, in fact, most of it is not their fault. Labour would have faced many of the same problems. But Labour will rightly exploit it from an electoral point of view in the same way that the Conservatives exploited the financial crisis 12 years ago, and that wasn't really Labour's fault.
All right, well, let's keep with Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, but on a completely different subject. These are the ongoing investigations by the Metropolitan Police, and we've had some of the findings from Sue Gray into parties at Downing Street and in Whitehall. You'll remember yesterday that we had in total, actually, 3 more Conservative MPs who've put in letters of no confidence in Boris Johnson in order to try and reach 54, which would trigger a contest. Well, the BBC's political editor Laura Kunsberg also asked about the impact on trust in government with the Chancellor.
Yes, I think it has. And, I can appreciate people's frustration. And I think it's now the job of all of us in government, all politicians, to restore people's trust. But I think the best way for me to play a part in that is by delivering on the things that people expect me to do, and that's making sure that we rebuild our economy after coronavirus, that we help people into work, that we help them with the cost of living as we're announcing today.
So, hit trust in government. I mean, it's pretty damning, isn't it, even by the Chancellor?
So I agree with the Chancellor. I mean, we have to get on with delivering, what we promised. I have to say that obviously I've had constituents write to me about the issues, and I have expressed my views very clearly that I agree entirely that it is upsetting that the standards of trust and compliance haven't been what they should have been, as a result of that, I think we're all on a kind of watching brief as to what comes out next.
Right. So, in your mind, is the Prime Minister on notice?
In my mind, we need to be sure that that there is a change of culture at Number 10, which is what the Prime Minister has said, as a result of the findings of Sue Gray. And we need to be sure that, no more will come out that will in any way undermine the trust in the government, because, our constituents are all looking and watching, and quite rightly so.
Do you still have confidence in Boris Johnson?
At the moment, I have confidence in the fact that he recognises that serious errors of judgment were made at Number 10, and I look forward to seeing the details. Well, I look forward to seeing the details. Clearly, the Sue Gray report focuses on
failures of leadership at Number 10 and in Whitehall.
It mentions
who is the head of Number 10.
So it mentions failures of leadership. I think the Prime Minister has come to the House and acknowledged the fact that he takes responsibility. So that's to my mind, all that we can say about it for now.
Michael, in terms of assessing the Prime Minister's future and his leadership, where do you think it is? We don't know how many letters have gone in. We never know. Oh, well, apart from the ones that have been said publicly, we don't know whether that's the full tally as such. But how long do you think this can go on for?
I think Boris Johnson won't be Prime Minister at the end of this year. But I do think it looks like being a slow process. The numbers have come out of Conservative MP, what is it now, about a dozen or something?
11, I think.
Who've come out publicly against him is so low that I don't sense that we're on the verge of 54. I mean, previously when these things have happened, you've got a lot nearer to 54 in terms of public denunciations. And so it's going to drag on through all the economic problems we've discussed and the local elections and, of course, the proper Sue Gray report and any follow-up by the police. But I think people are going to remember the events of the last few weeks. This is, in politics, every now and then there is a turning point. And like we had in 1992 with Black Wednesday, and it's very difficult to get the voters back after that. And although the economy did well under Ken Clarke after Black Wednesday, the Conservatives headed for a landslide defeat. Now, I don't think the next election is in the bag for Labour or anything like that, but I just don't think that Boris Johnson personally can turn round his reputation. I don't think the culture in a Boris Johnson Downing Street will change. But the one thing he's got going for him is that there is no obvious messiah figure in the wings in the way that he was the obvious alternative to Theresa May or Michael Heseltine was to Margaret Thatcher. There isn't really someone like that with supporters working away, undermining the incumbent.
Chris, how do you see it?
So I should say it's an unlikely turn of events that means this becomes past. If I were a Conservative MP, I think my calculation would be that every day you spend defending this man poisons you, and people sitting at home there'll be people in Stoke sitting at home saying, "Come on, Joe, why are you saying, why? How can you be waiting for this stuff?" Every day they send out someone to defend what is, you can see in the polling is considered to be indefensible, is another day closer to the election when the Conservatives are more damaged and more tainted. You can wait till the Sue Gray reports, at which point a reasonable person, member of the public, might say, "Hang on a minute, you're going to hang on to this guy even after you knew he was being reported to the police." Is this all electoral calculation? You can wait till May after the local elections and sacrifice a few hundred councillors on the altar of
Yes.
wait and see. I just don't understand the case for waiting.
Right.
When we can see from the polling how bad things are.
Well, you're here as a Tory MP. You're still waiting. Are you defending the indefensible? What's the point of waiting, as Chris says?
I don't think I'm here to defend anybody or anything. I'm here as a backbencher who is absolutely committed to delivering for my constituency on the levelling up promises. And at this moment in time, that is totally my focus. But as I said, I will wait and see what comes out from the full Segre report and the police report, and to be honest, how much personal responsibility is taken for what has gone on and culture change emerges.
Wendy, isn't that the right thing to do, to wait now for the Metropolitan Police report and any further details that Segre may or may not have?
Well, we were told 2 weeks ago, I had the first Prime Minister's questions 2 weeks ago, and I was told to wait for the Segre report. Now I'm being told to wait for the Metropolitan Police. Well, we've called already for him to resign. I absolutely believe that he should. And I agree with what Andrew Mitchell said earlier this week in terms of, and it ties with what Chris said, talking about as battery acid, that Boris Johnson's battery acid that corrodes the wider Conservative Party. And that's certainly what I get when I'm chapping doors in North East Fife, that people have noticed, absolutely, as Michael said, this is something that is absolutely cut through. Yes, the Conservatives can't be held accountable for a global pandemic and some of the economic issues they have, but what they can absolutely blamed for is a culture led by the Prime Minister that means we're focused on Partygate as opposed to dealing with those strategic issues.
All right, well, let's look at what is a rather uncertain picture today in Northern Ireland. Let me just show you this BBC headline. DUP, Northern Ireland First Minister Paul Givan intends to resign. This is something that the BBC revealed a few hours ago, that there is going to be a statement from him, taken in part because of the DUP's opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol, the post-Brexit trade arrangements for Northern Ireland that keep it inside the EU customs union for goods to prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland. We're joined now by Emma Vardy, our Ireland correspondent. Emma, Paul Givan's saying he's going to resign. Why?
Well, yeah, the party is poised to pull Paul Givan out of his role as First Minister today. And as you say, it is all about the long-running discontent over the protocol arrangements here in Northern Ireland. Now, that new Irish sea border, new checks on goods coming from Britain over to Northern Ireland means that the DUP and unionists more broadly feel this is a way of sort of severing Northern Ireland's place within the UK. And there's been anger over this ever since it was agreed. It was seen as a huge betrayal by Boris Johnson that he allowed this to happen. So, yeah, the DUP has been preparing for a long time, really, to take this step. Looking at different ways that it can, protest and undermine the protocol arrangements here in Northern Ireland. The first stage of that came last night when the Minister for Agriculture, DUP's Edwin Poots, said he had instructed civil servants to just halt those checks. And now the next step is the party being poised to effectively bring down the executive, because the power sharing arrangements here in Northern Ireland, a unique mandatory coalition because of Northern Ireland's history, are that if the First Minister resigns, well, that automatically triggers the resignation of the Deputy First Minister, Sinn Féin's Michelle O'Neill. And then you have real political paralysis here because one can't function without the other.
So this is a dramatic move that, as you say, could bring the whole thing down. And this is following Edwin Poots's announcement or order to halt those checks. I understand those checks are still continuing on goods between GB and Northern Ireland. But there has already been reaction from the government, the UK government, saying they didn't know that this was going to happen. And the EU saying that actually it could be illegal to actually order the halting of the checks because it could be in breach of the agreement that's been made. What's been the reaction?
Well, the DUP's political opponents in Northern Ireland have accused them of a political stunt. We are in the run-up to an election period here. This allows the DUP to say to its electorate, look, we are standing up at the very highest level to get rid of these Brexit arrangements that unionists dislike. Look, apart from the unionist parties here, the arrangements in terms of the Irish sea border were broadly supported by other parties here in the executive who don't want to see any checks needed over the Irish land border. They want to sort of continue the all-Ireland economy economy. So it is very much the DUP who are leading the charge on this now. So, of course, an angry reaction from opposition parties who accused them of electioneering, and, of course, an angry reaction from the EU too, who have continually said all the way through this was an arrangement the UK signed up to, and now you're breaking that.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much. Michael, what's the significance for you of this?
Well, it's another crisis for Downing Street, isn't it? I mean, right now, they've got Partygate, they've got the cost of living crisis, they've got this, and they've also got Ukraine, of course, which could turn out to be the biggest crisis of them all. And we have a Prime Minister who, frankly, is distracted and not up to the job. And we need somebody of higher calibre than Boris Johnson, I'm afraid.
Right. I mean, Jo, the government have said in response to Edwin Poots, the DUP minister, calling for halting of those checks, it was a matter for the Northern Ireland executive. That's not a sustainable position, is it, by the UK government?
Well, so I understand the Secretary of State also said that this really highlights the sensitivity of the Northern Ireland Protocol issue for the executive, and the fact that the EU haven't fully appreciated.
No, and they're blaming the DUP are also blaming the UK government for that, for not actually responding strongly enough against the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, I mean, the UK government has been very clear that, you know, the Good Friday Agreement and the way that the executive functions, you know, takes priority over the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I think that's a really important principle. Right. I mean, Chris, I mean, in terms of just thinking about how this could all unfold today over the next sort of 24, 36 hours, the power sharing could collapse.
Yeah, so I think the thing that Emma, being a good BBC reporter, didn't go into was the horrific low politics of all this as well, which is that the DUP's polling has collapsed. It's quite likely at the next election that they will almost certainly not be the largest party in the Assembly, which will mean, following the St Andrews Agreement, that Sinn Féin will probably end up being holding the First Minister position. It's a sort of symbolically big moment when a nationalist, for the first time, will lead Northern Ireland, not a unionist. And the DUP, in sort of fighting against this, is caught on one side by the Ulster Unionist Party, it's the moderate unionists, the party, you know, one of the two key parties of the Good Friday Agreement, and on the other side by Traditional Unionist Voice, which is a party that's really a fringe party historically, but which is now not that far from the DUP in the polls. The shattering of unionist opinion into shards, the UUP, the DUP, the TUV, and also the Alliance a little bit, is the backstory and why the DUP is in this sort of spiral of panic, not knowing what to do to restore its place.
Yes.
In terms of what's going to happen in the next few days, the good news is that civil servants in Northern Ireland are continuing to apply the law, and they're kind of stepping aside from this, which is important and valuable for minimising disruption. But yes, it looks like the Assembly will collapse in the next week.
Well, I mean, Wendy, the EU, though, will have to take stock of this, won't they? I mean, ongoing negotiations, EU Commission and the UK government between Liz Truss and Maros Sefcovic. And in a way, if you take what Chris has said about what the DUP, or the motivation behind what the DUP has done, it can't be ignored, though, can it, by the EU?
No, it can't be ignored, and it can't be ignored by the UK government either. To be honest, I find Brandon Lewis's position quite incredible. But by the same token, this is somebody who was comfortable in breaking international law in a specific and way in relation to the internal market bill last year. No, absolutely, neither the EU or the UK can ignore this. But I do agree with Chris, having spoken to my Alliance colleagues this morning, Alliance being our sister party. You know, it's not just about necessarily Paul Givan, who's been fairly sterile since all the machinations of the DUP leadership last year, but it's also about, this is the fact that they can't agree a budget now for the next financial year in April. COVID restrictions will need to remain in place as they are now, because there'll be no legislator to take that through. So basically, the DUP seem quite willing to institute some institutional vandalism, potentially to help them with the fringe parties that they're competing with in May.
Has the government caught with its eye off the ball here?
Well, I have only got the statement of the Secretary of State to go on, and it would appear that, you know, part of the principle of the executive powers in Northern Ireland is that they should be able to resolve these matters internally. So I know that the Secretary of State, George Eustace, is making a statement about the specifics of the imports, but I mean, clearly this has escalated now to something more serious.
Do you agree with Wendy that the DUP have behaved in a way that amounts to political vandalism?
I wouldn't wish to comment because that really that's beyond my scope of knowledge of their behaviour.
Michael?
I think
Chris,
vandalism is the wrong word, Jo, because it's you have to see it in the context of 5 years of some of the absolute worst political leadership we've ever seen in any significant party. The DUP fought for Brexit, then like a car, dog chasing a car, didn't know what to do with it when it finally got it. It had no plan for how it would resolve the border issues. It voted against Theresa May's deal, which would have minimised friction between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and then colluded to get rid of Theresa May, a very committed unionist who was mortified by the idea of an Irish sea border, to bring in this guy, like Boris Johnson, who sold them down the river. I mean, and they were told at every stage along the journey that this will what happened. This is going to happen. But I mean, it will go down in history as one of the all-time worst-led political parties, ever. It's extraordinary.
All right, well, on that momentous revelation by you, Chris, we're going to talk a little bit more about Brexit, and actually the government wants to talk about what it says are the benefits of Brexit. It's been 2 years since the UK left the EU. It has a 105-page report, but not all Conservatives think that the government is doing a good job. Here's Dan Hannan, Conservative peer, writing in Conservative Home. The government's new Brexit vision looks like thin, watery, tasteless gruel. Not very appetising, Jo.
I have to completely disagree with Dan on that. So the white paper, I think, provides a really strong framework for looking at how all government policy needs to be seen through the prism of levelling up. And levelling up, to my mind, is the delivery of Brexit, because it's basically about making sure that the people from left behind parts of the country feel the benefits of economic growth and are listened to. And that's, essentially, in a sentence, what Brexit was for people like my constituents.
When did you accept that?
Well, here we are at the start of this programme, talked about cost of living. If you remember, we were promised £350 million a week for the NHS, but we're now instituting a national insurance rise come April that will go to the NHS in the first instance and then be used for social care. So if we're talking about what was promised in relation to Brexit, I don't often agree with Dan Hannan, but I think he might be onto something.
Jo?
I mean, there's been more investment in the NHS over the last couple of years than there has, I think, probably in a generation. We've had a global pandemic and the need for extra investment in the NHS, as well as some of the major reforms. I think, I don't know how anybody can suggest that we haven't invested in the NHS, but we've also invested in education skills, looking at the issues that were the reasons for people voting for Brexit in the first place.
Right. I mean, Wendy, you were on the other side of the argument and lost in that sense. Apart from talking sort of buyer's remorse, would you accept that now this government is trying to make the best of Brexit and have those benefits, tangible benefits, with levelling up?
Well, again, it comes back to some of the things that we were talked about. So the Prime Minister in 2016 talked about VAT being something that the EU requires us to apply. We've got the opportunity to take VAT off energy bills, and the government are choosing not to do it. Nobody is stopping them. And in terms of that buyer's remorse, it comes back to our last conversation in relation to Northern Ireland. I spent my first week in Parliament in 2019 voting against the withdrawal agreement, which was rammed through. Then during a pandemic, we the actual agreement went through, and we're finding out that it is, now that we've departed the EU, we are beginning to see the consequences. Miles of queues in Dover, issues around supply chains that certainly came out in Scotland last year, and the government that apparently has these additional levers but is choosing to do nothing with them.
Right. I mean, Michael, there are certain Conservatives who just feel they're not getting what they thought Brexit would look like, which would be lower taxes, fewer regulations, as Dan Hannan goes on to say, cheaper energy, and moderate plans to apply the Working Time Directive, he says, in a more flexible way that several EU members do. Do you understand why they're disappointed?
I do understand why they're disappointed. And, of course, a lot of them are also disappointed by the cross-channel migration, which last month, January, was 6 times higher than it was the previous January. The government seems utterly powerless to stop that. And yet, at the same time, vast numbers of people have returned to the European Union, and we have severe labour shortages throughout all sorts of areas of the economy. So taking back control, which was actually a UKIP slogan to start with, not vote Leave, taking back control doesn't seem to have actually produced the results in terms of immigration that people were hoping for.
Chris?
I think it's... what we can say so far is that the government doesn't have a strategy for exploiting the freedoms it says it gains. We know that if fundamentally what the sort of Brexiteers have right is that if we become basically quite similar to the EU but outside its regulatory net, this isn't going to work. We're not going to be more prosperous. So we've already seen, for example, diversion of trade. We already know that our traded goods have dropped relative to their pre-pandemic performance. We know that the pre-Brexit performance as well, obviously. We know that business investment is hard to come by. We know there are shortages. At the moment, all we're getting is cost and no upside. But the fundamental problem is no one can really come up with a plan for this upside. And the trade deals, for example, that people talk about are minuscule, right? You fundamentally cannot. It is not a good deal to swap frictionless trade with Belgium for frictionless trade with Australia.
Without wanting to rehearse the arguments that were made, it was more than just about economics. Michael, it was about sovereignty. You've written your book about the significance of Nigel Farage, one of the architects of Brexit. How would you assess his significance politically?
I think he is the most important British politician of this century, the last 22 years, in other words. Yeah, the most influential, which is all the more remarkable when you think he was never elected to the House of Commons. But I think if it wasn't for the way in which Farage led UKIP in the early teens, the period after 2010, the coalition period, really, then the referendum would not have happened in the way it did. He then contributed to winning that referendum for the Brexit side, and then later on in forming the Brexit Party and effectively helping bring down Theresa May and paving the way to Boris Johnson. He played a huge contribution in ensuring that Brexit actually happened.
Right. Do you agree with that assessment? The book, by the way, is called One Party After Another. He is still a colourful character. And do you agree with the significance of him?
Well, I think there's no doubt that he was an external influence in terms of dragging the Conservative Party to the right, which means that we are left in a situation where Brexit has been promised to be so many things to so many people, and we're in a position now where we absolutely can't deliver.
Except he was so much more successful than your party was in persuading voters the other way.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that he was able to create a coalition that promised lots, and now we're seeing that maybe we were too reasonable in terms of talking about what we actually got from the EU, and maybe you sometimes don't realise what you've got till it's gone.
Is it about his personality as well as the position that he took?
A lot of it is about his personality. To my mind, he is the best political communicator of the last 20 years, even better than Boris Johnson, because he does the whole range. You know, he's a great broadcaster he's a professional broadcaster now on telly and radio. He's a great platform orator. He's great on the street. Boris Johnson, you often when you see him on the street, you always sort of sense he's not that comfortable. Farage loves engaging with people on the street and has a real innate sense of the way, I think, in which the public are feeling and voting, and there are not many people in our public life that have that.
Are you going to read the book, Jo?
Well, I'm sure Michael writes a good book, so, you know.
Oh, well, there you go. You've got one reader signed up. Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests. Thank you to you too, Chris. I will be back, of course, tomorrow with Politics UK. Yes, goodbye to you at 12:15. But from all of us here, bye-bye.